Warning, this episode discusses themes some listeners may find distressing.
From London, this is the Standard Podcast, and I'm Mark Blunden.
All of us have a responsibility to protect our children. Perpetrators must be punished and pursued. Victims and survivors must be protected and supported. But these crimes have not been taken seriously for too long, and far too many children have been failed. That is why this government is determined to act, strengthening the law, taking forward recommendations from independent inquiries, supporting stronger police action and protection for victims.
The government has announced new legal guidelines as part of a crackdown on child exploitation in the wake of the grooming gangs scandal. Measures revealed by Home Secretary Yvette Cooper include criminal sanctions for professionals working with children if they don't report sexual abuse claims.
Brave survivors speaking out have shone a light on terrible crimes and the failure of institutions to act, be it in care homes in Rochdale, Asian grooming gangs in Rotherham or Telford, abuse that was covered up within faith institutions, including the Church of England and Catholic Church, or within family homes. And that report, alongside other appalling crimes coming to light, is why, in opposition, our party called for a national independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and supported that work when it was launched by the previous government.
The recommendation is among those within Professor Alexis Jay's 7-year child sexual abuse inquiry published in 2022. And she told Radio 4's Today programme that there was enough of inquiries and instead victims needed action. The government has refused to commit to a public inquiry despite calls from opposition Conservatives and an online firestorm fomented on X by the platform's boss Elon Musk. Authorities face allegations that they ignored horrific abuse of thousands of vulnerable young, mostly white girls, trafficked, groomed and raped by groups of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage, in towns including Rotherham, Oldham, Telford and Rochdale, amid fears of being labelled as racist. Now we're joined by the London Standard's courts correspondent Tristan Kirk, who argues in a comment article for standard.co.uk that a new public inquiry is not the answer to the urgent action needed. So what is? Could you please give us an overview of your thoughts on these calls for a public inquiry into the child grooming gangs that were contained in your comment piece?
There's no doubt that public inquiries have a use and are incredibly important in some cases. And there's also no doubt that the issue of grooming gangs and child sexual abuse is incredibly important to the public and especially to the victims who've suffered over the years and frankly been ignored for long periods when they should have been listened to. But the calls for a public inquiry are, in my opinion, completely wrong-headed because they won't do the thing that people presumably want to happen. What people are looking for is justice for child sexual abuse to be stopped and for the perpetrators to be called to account, to be brought to justice and in all likelihood sent to prison. And what people are also looking out for is for there to be responsibility from those people in charge to listen to victims when they come forward, to take their complaints seriously and to investigate grooming gangs, child sexual abuse, organised crime in a way that people would expect it to happen, where there is no hidden agendas and no hiding the truth. Public inquiry could pick over those things over several years. It would be lengthy and it would cost an enormous amount. But what we really need is for there to be that kind of significant investment in criminal justice, in the police forces who can tackle grooming gangs and the scourge of sexual abuse, for there to be proper investment in the courts, and for the outcome of a previous inquiry or inquiries indeed into child sexual abuse to be actually enacted. We've had solutions, or at least the start of solutions to these problems on the political agenda since 2022, and nobody seems to have done anything about it. The answer is not calling a new public inquiry. It's at the very least to start doing something about the existing public inquiry.
You argue in your comment piece that televised inquiries don't necessarily translate into real progress. And also this comes as Jess Phillips says Oldham council should do another local review as opposed to the national one that was being called for. Is there a more workable alternative that perhaps would be more legally binding and seen as more authoritative than national review? Is there an alternative?
Well, I think if we're going to continue to call public inquiries, then they need to start having teeth, and the chair should have the power to order that their recommendations are actually enacted within a reasonable time frame. We got to the end of the Grenfell Tower inquiry and there was an incredibly damning report. Then it's left to the politicians to decide which bits and which recommendations they're actually going to adopt and in what form that's going to come. If the public inquiry is important enough to be called, then it should be able to say at the end of this is what we found and this is what you must do, not just a case of you might fancy doing this at some point. The post office inquiry, which is obviously still ongoing, the justice for the sub-postmasters has still not really been delivered. The compensation is still outstanding for many of them. And, we should have a system that actually delivers that at a point when it's legitimate and when it's needed, not many years later. The infected blood scandal inquiry went on for years, and it was only once the inquiry had actually come to an end that, we started seriously talking about compensation for the victims. Well, a lot of the victims died before receiving that compensation, and that should be obvious in a scandal like that when health is involved. I think that if you're going to call public inquiries, then you should empower the judges to not just make recommendations, but push forward laws and real changes, and it should be incumbent on the government to adopt those seriously and quickly as well.
What do you make of the politicking around this horrific case with critics branded racist or far right?
Well, the first thing to say is that it's obviously there's nothing wrong with being concerned about child sex abuse, grooming gangs. It is a serious problem, and it does need to be taken seriously and tackled. It's not, a right-wing thing necessarily. The branding of people who are calling for a public inquiry as far right is problematic, because then that can be used against the government to say that people are being pigeonholed when they've got legitimate concerns. The difficulty is that a lot of the clamour and online chatter is being led by Elon Musk, who is expressing some rather bizarre sentiments about dissolving parliament and locking up political leaders. And he has, I think, undoubtedly strayed into areas that could be considered far right. And so the way that the commentary around this case is being categorized is difficult for the government, and they need to tackle people's legitimate concerns rather than just dismissing it as far right. But I think there's an undoubted element of that, certainly in the online discussions.
Let's go to a quick break. Coming up in part 2, inside the criminal trials of the child grooming gangs and why the legal system needs urgent reform. If you're new here, please do make sure to hit follow and give us a rating. Welcome back. Now it's back to the London Standard's courts correspondent, Tristan Kirk. You've sat through many of these harrowing trials. What impression did you get of the legal process, coping with so many defendants, and also particularly raking up the trauma for victims, often many years afterwards?
When you sit through trials involving this kind of abuse, it's, first of all, very harrowing. These are terrible, terrible crimes. The details are always awful, and particularly with the gangs where it was organised and it was well concealed. You're talking about events that happened over the course of many years where victims felt like they couldn't speak out, that they wouldn't be believed, that their story was essentially never going to be told. And the power imbalance is really, really stark with the people who are accused and subsequently convicted of these crimes almost felt untouchable when they were doing just unspeakable things. So it is really horrendous stuff to hear. And one of the things that certainly marks out this kind of trial is the length of time it actually takes to get through the court system, which is a real problem. You're often talking about multiple defendants, sometimes 15, 20 defendants. So you may be looking at several trials for everyone to get through the court system. That sometimes involves the victims of the abuse giving evidence about the same things repeatedly because it has to be heard in different trials. And you're talking about years in the justice system. So when you've got cases like that, there is a real urgency to get them going as fast as possible and make sure that everything is as expedited as possible. And frankly, in the justice system that we've got at the moment, that isn't possible. There needs to be a pretty radical overhaul of how the system works in order to deliver the kind of justice that doesn't leave people feeling angry, frustrated, and looking elsewhere for some kind of justice.
You mentioned in your piece about these more than 380 criminal trials involving sexual offences being abandoned after problems finding legal personnel. We've spoken about this before in terms of the legal infrastructure, but what more do you think the courts need to do to keep up?
The frustrating thing for me is that there's an awful lot of political attention and commentary being focused on the idea of a public inquiry getting to the bottom of these terrible crimes, but almost no attention being paid on the utterly broken criminal justice system that we have in this country, which is the tool which could tackle these kinds of crimes and bring to light the kind of illegal activities and gang activities that are going on. I mentioned in my article that over the last year or so, more than 380 criminal trials involving sexual offences have not taken place. So essentially had to be abandoned, delayed, adjourned because either a barrister or a judge couldn't be found. That's a startling fact, but also is something that is now a well-known symptom within our criminal justice system. It has, in my view, undergone managed decline for the last decade at least, if not longer, where successive governments, politicians have not focused the attention that criminal justice needs, cut the budgets back to the bone, and allowed it to become an area of our society that is neglected and doesn't work properly, putting it frankly. So now we don't have enough lawyers practicing in this area. We don't have enough judges to hear the cases. A lot of court buildings were sold off when there was cost cutting. And so you've got a system that is incredibly fragile. Any kind of shock to it has a massive impact. We've obviously heard in recent times about the prisons being full, and that has the impact of the court system is trying to sentence people, but is now finding that there aren't places in prison to put them. And so the knock-on effects of all of this is just this enormous mess within our criminal justice system. And that has real world impacts. So when you talk about numbers like 380 criminal trials not being able to take place involving sexual offences, then that is at least 380 victims or alleged victims, and probably many more than that, who thought they were going to have their day in court, thought they were going to have justice, and then they get told, not today, possibly not even this year. You know, we're looking at 2-3 year delays, cases being listed in 2028. That's the reality that we have to tackle. And it would be far more helpful if people are angry about crimes like this, like child sexual abuse and rape and crimes against women and girls, that it would be far more useful if they were angry about the state of the criminal justice system and wanted to hold the people responsible for that to account, the political leaders who haven't invested the money, the time, the energy, or the political capital in making us have a criminal justice system that actually works.
And that's The Standard. For the latest news, head over to standard.co.uk. This podcast is back on Wednesday at 4 p.m.